Hey everyone, welcome back to English Inside Out. Today we're talking about three expressions that native speakers use constantly. And honestly, they're so common that most native speakers don't even notice they're using them.
Yeah, and what's funny is that these expressions are not difficult. They're not advanced grammar. They're not sophisticated vocabulary. They're not the kind of thing people usually study. But somehow, they're everywhere.
Exactly. If you listen to podcasts, watch interviews, listen to friends talking, watch TV shows, you'll hear them constantly. Anyway, by the way, and yet, many English learners almost never use them.
And honestly, I think that's because learners usually focus on information. They learn words that describe things, words that describe actions, words that describe feelings. But these three expressions do something completely different. They don't really add information. They guide the conversation.
Yeah. And I think that's why they're so difficult to explain. Because if you open a dictionary, the definitions don't really tell the whole story. You can learn what they mean and still have no idea when to use them naturally. Because native speakers don't use these expressions to communicate facts. They use them to manage conversations, to organize thoughts, to guide the listener, to move from one idea to another.
Exactly. And honestly, once you notice them, you start hearing them everywhere because they're part of the invisible structure of spoken English. Let's imagine something. Imagine two people talking, and imagine they never use. Anyway, by the way, the conversation would still be understandable, but it would feel strange. A little robotic, a little rigid.
Yeah, because real conversations are messy. People change topics. They clarify things. They go off track. They come back. They rethink what they just said. And these expressions help us do all of that smoothly.
Actually, I think there's a really useful way to visualize all three. Imagine a conversation is a road trip.
Okay, I like where this is going already.
You're driving down a road, moving from one idea to another, one topic to another, one story to another, and these three expressions help you navigate that road. Anyway, helps you get back on the main road. Maybe you got distracted. Maybe the conversation took a detour. Maybe someone interrupted. Anyway says, let's get back to where we were.
And then we have, by the way, that's like taking a small side road. You're still traveling, but suddenly you remember something related, something interesting, and you briefly leave the main road to mention it.
And then we have, which is different again, because now you're not changing direction, you're adjusting direction. You stop for a second and say, that's not exactly what I wanted to say. Let me explain that better. Let me be more precise.
So if we simplify it, anyway gets you back on track. By the way, takes you somewhere new for a moment. Helps you adjust what you're saying.
And honestly, this is one of those things that separates correct English from natural English. Because learners often know thousands of words, but conversations still feel stiff.
Yeah. And sometimes the missing piece isn't vocabulary. It's conversational flow, the ability to guide people through your thoughts naturally. Think about a friend telling a story. They start talking about their weekend. Then they remember something funny. Then they clarify a detail. Then they return to the original story. That entire process is full of, anyway, by the way, whether you notice it or not.
And honestly, I don't think this episode is really about three expressions. I think it's about something bigger. It's about how conversations move, how people connect ideas, how native speakers guide listeners through their thoughts. And by the end of today's episode, you probably won't think of, anyway, by the way, as vocabulary anymore.
You'll start seeing them as tools, conversation tools, navigation tools. The little signals that make spoken English feel natural.
All right, let's start with the one that might be the most useful of all.
Because every conversation gets distracted eventually, and sooner or later, someone has to find the road again.
And that's exactly where, anyway, comes in. All right, so let's start with anyway. And honestly, this might be one of the most useful words in spoken English. Not because it has a complicated meaning, but because conversations almost never move in a straight line.
Yeah, people get distracted constantly. Someone remembers a story. Someone asks a question. Someone interrupts. A dog starts barking. A phone rings. A completely unrelated topic appears out of nowhere. And somehow, the conversation has to find its way back. And that's exactly what "anyway" does. It tells people, let's return to the original topic. It's like saying, where were we? Let's continue. Back to the main point.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that native speakers use it constantly without thinking about it, because conversations naturally drift, and anyway helps bring them home. Imagine you're telling a friend about your vacation. You start describing the hotel. Then suddenly, you remember a funny story about the taxi driver. You spend 2 minutes talking about that. Everyone laughs. The story ends, and then you say, anyway, the hotel was amazing.
That feels completely natural, because you're telling the listener, the taxi story was a detour. Now we're returning to the main story. And honestly, I think "anyway" feels like momentum. It's a word that moves conversations forward, because without it, people can get stuck. They can stay on side topics forever.
Yeah, it's almost like a gentle reset button. Not rude, not abrupt. Just, okay, let's continue.
Imagine you're in a meeting. Someone starts talking about a software issue. Then another person remembers a completely unrelated problem from last month. Now everybody is discussing that instead. 5 minutes pass, and finally someone says, anyway, let's get back to the budget discussion.
That's incredibly natural workplace English, because meetings drift all the time, and somebody usually needs to guide everyone back. And honestly, this is something learners often miss. Anyway, isn't really adding new information. The meeting topic hasn't changed. The budget hasn't changed. What changed is direction. You're managing attention.
Exactly. And that's why translating "anyway" can be frustrating. Because the real purpose isn't vocabulary. The real purpose is navigation. Let's go back to the road trip metaphor. Imagine you're driving somewhere. You take a wrong turn. You explore a side street, maybe 2 side streets. Then eventually the GPS says, return to the route. That's basically what "anyway" does in conversation.
I love that, because it doesn't erase the detour. The detour happened. It just says, now let's continue the journey. Another really common use is ending a topic politely. For example, imagine you've been talking about something for a while. The conversation naturally slows down, and you say, anyway. That word often signals, I'm ready to move on.
Yeah, not because the topic was bad, not because you're bored, just because conversations naturally evolve. And "anyway" helps create that transition smoothly. Imagine 2 friends talking. One of them spends 10 minutes complaining about airline delays. Eventually, there's nothing left to say. And then, anyway, how was your trip? That feels very natural.
Exactly. The first topic is finished, and anyway creates a bridge to the next one. Honestly, I think anyway is one of the most human words in English, because it acknowledges something that's true about all conversations. People don't think in straight lines. They wander, they remember things, they get distracted, and then they return.
Actually, even in this episode, imagine we suddenly spent 5 minutes talking about coffee, or travel, or dogs. Eventually, one of us would probably say, anyway. And everybody listening would instantly understand, we're going back to the main topic now.
Yeah, that's how powerful the word is. Everybody understands the signal immediately. So if you start paying attention to podcasts, interviews, YouTube videos, you'll notice something. Native speakers use anyway, less to communicate ideas and more to organize ideas. That's the real secret.
So if we simplify everything about "anyway," it helps you return to the main topic. It helps you move forward. It helps you end detours. And it helps conversations keep their momentum.
Yeah, and maybe the easiest way to remember it is, you're back on the main road. The conversation wandered. Now it's moving forward again. Alright, so that's. Anyway, it brings you back.
But sometimes, you don't want to go back. Sometimes you suddenly remember something interesting, something unexpected, something that wasn't part of the original conversation at all.
And that's exactly where, by the way, comes in.
All right, so now let's talk about by the way. And honestly, this might be one of the most natural expressions in spoken English, because conversations don't always move in one direction. Sometimes you're talking about one thing, and suddenly your brain remembers something completely different.
Yeah. And what's funny is that this happens constantly. You're discussing work, then you remember a restaurant. You're talking about a movie, then you remember a message you forgot to send. You're discussing your weekend, then suddenly you remember somebody's birthday. And that's exactly where, by the way, becomes useful. Because unlike anyway, which brings you back to the main road, by the way, does the opposite. It takes you somewhere else for a moment.
Exactly. It's like saying, before I forget, this just reminded me. There's something else I want to mention. You're introducing a new idea, but you're doing it softly. Imagine you're talking to a friend about work. You've been discussing a project for several minutes, and suddenly you remember something. You say, by the way, did you ever hear back from that company?
Notice how natural that feels. The new topic wasn't part of the original conversation, but it doesn't feel random, because, by the way, prepares the listener. It signals, I'm changing direction for a moment, and honestly, I think by the way feels lighter than people realize. It's not a dramatic topic change. It's not, let's discuss something completely different. It's more like, oh, this just came to mind.
Yeah, it's conversational, relaxed, natural, the kind of thing people do when they're comfortable talking to each other. Let's go back to our road trip. You're driving along the main road. Everything is moving normally. And then you see a small side road. Not a huge detour, just a quick turn. That's by the way.
Exactly. You're not abandoning the journey. You're just exploring something nearby for a moment. This expression appears constantly in relationships. For example, you're having dinner with someone, you're talking about your day, and suddenly you remember something. By the way, my sister is visiting next weekend. That feels incredibly natural.
Yeah, because life isn't organized into perfect categories. People remember things when they remember them. And, by the way, gives them a smooth way to introduce those ideas. Imagine you're finishing a meeting. Everyone is packing up their laptops. The conversation is basically over. And then someone says, by the way, the client moved the deadline. Immediately, everybody pays attention.
Yeah, and that's another interesting thing. Sometimes, by the way, introduces something small, and sometimes it introduces something important. The phrase itself doesn't tell us how important the information is. It simply tells us, here's something else. And honestly, I think learners sometimes hesitate to use by the way because they feel like they're interrupting. But native speakers don't hear it that way.
Exactly. They hear it as a social signal, a polite transition, a way of adding information without sounding abrupt. Imagine you're texting a friend. You've been talking about vacation plans. The conversation is almost finished. And then you suddenly remember, by the way, congratulations on your promotion. That's such a natural use.
Yeah, because it wasn't the main topic, but it still deserved a mention. If you start listening carefully, you'll notice that native speakers often use by the way when an idea appears unexpectedly, not randomly. Unexpectedly. There's a difference. The idea is connected somehow. It simply wasn't part of the original route.
Let's compare. Anyway, we're returning. By the way, we're branching off, very different directions.
Exactly. One brings the conversation back, the other gently takes it somewhere else. And honestly, I think this is why conversations feel so fluid among native speakers, because people don't jump from topic to topic suddenly. They use little bridges, little signals, little pieces of conversational navigation, and, by the way, is one of the most common bridges in spoken English.
So if we simplify everything about by the way, it introduces a new idea. It changes direction gently. It helps you remember things naturally. And it creates smooth topic transitions.
Yeah, and maybe the easiest way to remember it is, you're taking a small side road. Not forever. Just long enough to mention something important. Alright, so now we've seen. Anyway, brings us back to the road. By the way, takes us down a side road.
But sometimes the road isn't the problem. Sometimes the problem is that what you just said isn't exactly what you meant.
And that's where one of the most human expressions in English appears. I mean... Alright, now let's talk about I mean. And honestly, this might be one of the most misunderstood expressions in English, because if you translate it literally, it sounds like it's about meaning.
Yeah, people learn that. I mean means you quero decir. And technically, that's true. But honestly, that explanation doesn't really help very much, because native speakers use I mean in situations where they're not translating thoughts. They're adjusting thoughts. Because most of the time, when someone says, I mean, they're not introducing a new idea. They're improving the idea they just expressed.
Exactly. It's almost like saying, let me say that better. That's not exactly what I meant. Let me be more precise. Imagine someone asks, how was the movie? And you say, it was good. Then you stop for a second and realize that good isn't really accurate. So you continue, I mean, it wasn't amazing, but I enjoyed it.
That feels incredibly natural. Because you're adjusting the picture. You're refining the message. You're helping the listener understand your real opinion. And honestly, I think I mean feels very human. Because people rarely say exactly what they want to say on the first attempt. We think while speaking. We search for better words. We clarify ideas. And I mean gives us permission to do that.
Yeah, it's almost like thinking out loud. The listener gets to watch you organize your thoughts in real time. Let's go back to our road trip metaphor. With, anyway, you return to the road. With, by the way, you took a side road, but, I mean, is different. You're still on the same road. You're just adjusting the steering wheel. A little to the left, a little to the right, making sure you're heading exactly where you want to go.
I love that. Because you're not changing topics. You're changing precision. This happens constantly when people express opinions. For example, the restaurant was terrible. Pause. I mean, the food was great. The service was terrible. Now the opinion becomes more accurate.
Exactly. The first sentence was too broad. The second one gives a clearer picture, and that's a huge part of natural conversation. Honestly, I think learners sometimes expect spoken English to sound perfectly organized, like a written article, like a textbook. But real conversations don't work that way. People revise, people clarify, people correct themselves. And I mean is one of the tools that makes that process feel natural.
Imagine you're describing a coworker. You say, he's difficult. And immediately you realize that's not exactly what you want to communicate. So you continue. I mean, he's not difficult. He's just very direct. That's a perfect example.
Yeah, the listener can actually hear your thinking process. You're adjusting the description in real time. Another interesting thing is that I mean often appears when people are talking about emotions. Because emotions are complicated. For example, I'm angry. Pause. I mean, maybe angry isn't the right word. I'm disappointed.
That's such a natural use. Because emotions aren't always easy to describe. Sometimes we need a second attempt, and I mean helps us get there. Imagine a friend asks, do you like your new job? And you answer, yeah, I like it. Then you think for a second and say, I mean, I like the people. I'm still not sure about the work itself. Now the answer becomes more honest, more precise, more human.
If you pay attention, you'll notice something. Anyway, changes direction. By the way, introduces direction. I mean, improves direction. It's not about where the conversation goes. It's about making sure it goes there accurately.
Let's compare all three. Anyway, let's get back to the project. Returning. By the way, did you see the client's email? Adding a new topic. The project is difficult. I mean, it's not difficult, it's just taking longer than expected. Clarifying.
And honestly, I think this is one of the biggest differences between textbook English and real English. Textbooks often show perfect sentences. Real people don't speak in perfect sentences. They speak in evolving sentences. And I mean is one of the expressions that allows that evolution to happen naturally.
So if we simplify everything about, it clarifies ideas. It adjusts meaning. It makes thoughts more precise. And it helps people think while speaking.
Yeah, and maybe the easiest way to remember it is, you're adjusting the steering wheel. You're still going in the same direction. You're just making the route clearer. All right, so now we've explored all three. Anyway, by the way,
And now comes the really interesting part. Because when you hear native speakers talking naturally, these three expressions are constantly working together behind the scenes.
all right, so now let's put everything together. Because honestly, native speakers don't think, now I'm going to use anyway. Now I'm going to use by the way. Now I'm going to use I mean. That would be impossible. Conversations move too fast.
Exactly. People use these expressions automatically. And that's because they're not really vocabulary. They're conversational habits. Little signals that help conversations flow naturally. Think about a conversation as a moving stream. Ideas are constantly appearing, changing, evolving, and these expressions help manage that movement.
Yeah, without them, conversations often feel abrupt, like ideas are colliding with each other. With them, everything feels smoother, more connected, more human. Let's imagine two friends meeting for coffee. Just listen to how naturally these expressions appear.
So how's the new job?
It's good. The people are great. I'm still adjusting to the workload.
That makes sense.
By the way, have you talked to Sarah recently?
Actually, yes.
A few minutes later,
Anyway, back to the job. When do you finish training?
Look at what happened. Clarified an idea. By the way, introduced a new topic. Anyway, returned to the original topic. That's conversational navigation in action. Now imagine a workplace conversation.
How's the project going?
It's moving forward. We're slightly behind schedule, but we're making progress.
Good.
By the way, the client requested another revision.
A few minutes later,
Anyway, let's focus on tomorrow's deadline.
notice something interesting. Nobody is consciously thinking about these expressions. They're simply helping the conversation move, almost like invisible traffic signs. And honestly, I think this explains why some learners sound extremely accurate, but not completely natural. Their grammar is fine, their vocabulary is fine, but everything feels very direct, very linear, very controlled.
yeah. Because real conversations are not perfectly linear. People remember things, adjust ideas, revisit topics, change direction all the time. And these expressions help make those transitions feel effortless. Let's compare two versions. Version 1, the movie was bad, the acting was weak, the story was confusing. Completely understandable. Now version 2, the movie was bad. The acting wasn't terrible. The story was just really confusing. Immediately more natural, more conversational.
Exactly. The second version sounds like a real person thinking, not a report. Honestly, I think that's the secret behind all three expressions. They make speech feel alive. Because real thinking isn't perfectly organized. Real thinking is messy. And these expressions allow that messiness to sound natural.
Actually, after this episode, try something. Listen to a podcast, any podcast, and count how many times you hear. Anyway, by the way, you'll probably be surprised.
Yeah, because once you notice them, you can't stop noticing them. They're everywhere. Not because native speakers need them, because conversations need them, so let's bring everything together. Anyway, gets you back on track. By the way, introduces a side topic. Clarifies your message.
Or maybe even simpler. Anyway, guides the conversation. By the way, redirects the conversation. Refines the conversation.
All right, so before we finish, let's zoom out one last time.
Because I think the biggest lesson today isn't really about three expressions. It's about understanding how conversations actually work. All right, so before we finish, let's zoom out for a second. Because today wasn't really about learning three expressions. And honestly, I think that's the most important thing to understand.
Yeah, because if you look at everything we explored today, we weren't talking about vocabulary, at least not in the traditional sense. We were talking about conversation itself, how conversations move, how ideas connect, how people guide each other through their thoughts.
And honestly, that's something many learners don't realize at first. They focus on words that carry information, words like success, opportunity, project, travel. But native speakers spend a huge amount of time using words that don't really add information. They add direction. Imagine somebody says, "I got the promotion." That's information. Now imagine they say, "I got the promotion. By the way, thanks for helping me prepare for the interview." The second sentence isn't just information anymore. It's a relationship. It's a conversation. It's a human interaction.
Exactly. And that's why these expressions matter so much. They help conversations feel natural instead of mechanical. So let's simplify everything one last time. Anyway, helps you return. By the way, helps you introduce something new. Helps you clarify what you're trying to say.
Let's go back to our road trip metaphor. You're driving down a road. Sometimes you get distracted. That's when, anyway, brings you back. Sometimes you remember something important. That's when, by the way, takes a small side road. And sometimes you realize your explanation isn't quite right. That's when, helps you adjust your direction.
Honestly, I think one reason native speakers sound so natural isn't because they know more vocabulary. It's because they're constantly helping the listener. They're giving signals. They're guiding attention. They're making conversations easier to follow. And these three expressions do exactly that.
Because real conversations are messy. People interrupt themselves. People remember things suddenly. People change topics. People rethink what they just said. And that's normal. Actually, that's what makes conversations feel human.
Yeah, nobody talks like a textbook. Nobody speaks in perfectly organized paragraphs. Real speech is flexible, and these expressions help us navigate that flexibility. So maybe the biggest idea from today is this: native speakers don't use these expressions to communicate information. They use them to communicate direction.
And honestly, once you start seeing them that way, you'll start hearing them everywhere. So here's a challenge. The next time you watch a podcast, an interview, a YouTube video, a TV show, listen specifically for "anyway, by the way, and pay attention to what they're doing. Not what they mean, what they're doing.
Yeah, watch how they move the conversation, because that's the real lesson. And before we go, tell us in the comments, which one do you hear most often? Anyway, by the way, and which one do you think you'll start using more in your own English?
And don't worry about using them perfectly. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is starting to sound more natural, a little more conversational, a little more like yourself in English. And if this episode helped you understand why native speakers use these expressions all the time, share it with someone who's trying to move from textbook English to real English.
And don't forget to subscribe for real English
Real conversations.
and real progress. See you in the next episode.
Bye, everyone.